carry a heavy burden on your shoulders, and you do not need me to tell you that the eyes and hopes of the world are upon you, to act with all dispatch and decisively, because time has quite literally run out. The scale and scope of the threat we face call for a global systems level.
King Charles recently sat down, or rather, was obliged to sit down, during the state opening of Parliament, looking distinctly unimpressed as he delivered his speech to the nation. And honestly, who could blame him? Because here we are, nearly a decade after Britain voted to leave the European Union, and the establishment is doing exactly what it's always done, absolutely nothing revolutionary. In fact, it's doing something far worse. It's capitulating. And one man who's been screaming about this from the rooftops is about to tell us precisely why he thinks our government is committing an act of despair. His name is John Longworth, and his message is absolutely brutal. This is not your typical Westminster insider handing out polite platitudes. This is a man who literally torched his own career at the British Chambers of Commerce because he refused to stay silent about the EU's inability to reform. And what we're about to discuss today is why this Brexit warrior now believes that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves are leading Britain straight into an economic doom loop. So if you want to understand what's really happening behind the scenes at Number 10, you need to watch this to the end. If you haven't already, please subscribe because we're about to get properly into it. Let's establish something from the beginning. John Longworth was not some fringe activist with a Twitter following and questionable opinions. He spent years at the absolute heart of British commerce. Tesco, Asda, the British Chambers of Commerce. He was embedded in the establishment, living the comfortable life that establishment figures are supposed to live. And then he saw something that terrified him so much that he was willing to sacrifice all of it. He looked at the trajectory of the European Union and he said categorically that it was incapable of meaningful reform. That wasn't some throwaway comment. That was a declaration of war. And Downing Street responded accordingly. His suspension from the British Chambers of Commerce wasn't just a minor career setback. It was a message. Fall in line, or you're out. But Longworth didn't fall in line. Instead, he threw himself into the Brexit campaign with absolute conviction, and then he did something remarkable. He won a seat in the European Parliament as part of Nigel Farage's Brexit Party. But here's the thing that keeps him up at night now, and this is where it gets genuinely chilling. He's realized something that most people haven't quite grasped. We won the revolution, but we left the establishment in charge. Think about that for a moment. Britain voted for fundamental change in 2016. The people spoke. And what did we get? A conservative government, then Boris Johnson, then Liz Truss, and now a Labour government that's actively trying to repair ties with Brussels and reset relations with the EU. It's not just disappointing, it's almost farcical. The architects of the status quo simply change their tactics instead of changing the system. Longworth's diagnosis is simple and devastating. He says, and we quote, "This idea we are a wealthy country is complete nonsense. In terms of people's prosperity, we are in dire straits." Now, when a man who spent a lifetime building businesses says that, we should listen. And is not just throwing around rhetoric. He's looked at the world. He's traveled to the Amazon searching for soybeans. He's witnessed the explosive growth of Asian economies. He's seen what real prosperity looks like. And has come to a rather uncomfortable conclusion. Britain has been in managed decline for decades, and nobody in charge seemed particularly motivated to stop it. Back in the 1990s, Longworth would tell colleagues, "We need to start loading planes up to take people out to Asia to see what real growth looks like, because they have no idea." That's not hyperbole. That's desperation wrapped in pragmatism. He understood, through genuine business experience, that Britain was being left behind. The legislative burden of the European Union wasn't the whole problem, but it was part of an ecosystem that made Britain progressively less competitive, more bureaucratic, and increasingly incapable of moving at the speed the modern economy demands. So when the Brexit referendum came around, he didn't see it as a protest vote. He saw it as a potential liberation. Yet liberation never quite arrived. Because here's a fundamental problem that Longworth keeps returning to. The people who fought hardest against Brexit won the war without appearing to lose. The civil service, the BBC, the establishment media, the business elite. They might have lost a referendum vote, but they ensured that those charged with implementing Brexit will be dragged kicking and screaming through the entire process. Theresa May, described by Longworth as a terrible prime minister, spent years negotiating a deal so feeble that it satisfied almost nobody. Years of gridlock. Years of obstruction. Meanwhile, civil servants worked overtime to ensure that Brexit would deliver as little actual change as possible. When Longworth arrived in Brussels as an MEP, he was under no illusions about British EU membership. He saw it clearly. The whole objective was to create a federal state, and Britain misunderstood this again and again. Think about the implications of that statement. The EU's founding fathers were always building toward a superstate. Britain joined in an act of despair, according to Longworth, because we were a declining imperial power trying to reassert relevance. We joined not as architects, but as supplicants. And ever since, we've been operating as though we're part of something we fundamentally didn't sign up for. This is where Longworth's conflict with Farage becomes crucial. By the 2019 general election, Longworth wanted the Brexit Party to focus ruthlessly on winning 20 to 30 seats, enough to hold the Conservative Party accountable and force genuine change. Instead, the Brexit Party stood candidates across the country, splitting the right-wing vote and handing victory to Labour in countless marginals. So Longworth did something controversial. He backed Boris Johnson's Conservatives. His priority was singular: get Brexit done. And the Tories won a landslide. But here's where it gets genuinely tragic. Johnson got Brexit done, and then he immediately proceeded to govern as though he'd won a mandate for absolute chaos. Net zero madness. The Boris wave of migration, mass immigration that somehow accelerated after we'd left the EU. The very things people were supposed to get control over post-Brexit. The establishment had won again. They'd neutralized the revolutionary energy of the referendum vote by ensuring that the follow-up government would squander the political capital in every direction except the one that mattered. And now we have Keir Starmer in Downing Street, and Longworth sees something genuinely alarming happening. Starmer is cozying up to the EU in what Longworth describes, quite bluntly, as an act of despair. Is giving away concessions and getting nothing in return. It's Edward Heath's original membership push all over again, a politician who believed Britain's future lay in European integration, when actually our future lies in genuine independence, genuine competition, and genuine accountability to voters. The tragedy, for Longworth, is that so many of our political leaders have minimal genuine business experience. They operate in a bubble where there are no competitive pressures, no requirement for ruthless efficiency, no obligation to serve customer interests or lose market share. Whitehall, he argues, has no internal competition whatsoever. Meanwhile, supermarkets transform the entire dynamic of British commerce by respecting consumers and forcing manufacturers to compete for shelf space. That's not a trivial point. That's a statement about how power flows when you introduce genuine competitive pressure. Longworth grew up in Bolton in a terraced house next door to a mill. His father was IAF, managed a dairy. He was the first in his family to go to university, environmental sciences, then atmospheric physics. When Keith Joseph, Margaret Thatcher's intellectual architect, spoke at Salford University, young John Longworth was electrified. Joseph was a genius. He represented an era when Britain could still think in terms of genuine transformation, not manage decline masquerading as prudent governance. And this brings us to Longworth's current great fear, that Britain gets locked into an economic doom loop from which we can't escape. But here's where he differs fundamentally from the doom merchants. He believes there's a way out. He believes, with genuine conviction born of decades in business, that just one thing alone would transform the economy. Scrap net zero madness. Open up North Sea oil and gas drilling. Embrace fracking. Shrink the size of the state. Cut taxes. And according to Longworth, people would be amazed how quickly things change. His not being naive about this. His watch Britain escape the quagmire of the 1970s before. He knows recovery is possible. He knows that when you remove the chains that inhibit entrepreneurship and innovation, British businesses can compete with anyone globally. The problem is political will. The problem is that we have governments that seem actively committed to preventing genuine recovery because recovery would require admitting the establishment's mistakes. So here we are in October 2025, with King Charles watching from the throne as governments of various stripes continue doing precisely what they've always done, shuffling the deck chairs while the ship drifts. John Longworth is telling us that this is not sustainable. He chairs the Independent Business Network now, championing family-owned businesses and fighting to make Brexit actually mean something. He is not standing for election again, though he admits he'd reluctantly accept a peerage if they wanted him as a business spokesperson, an offer, he suggests, that's about as likely as rain in the Sahara. But his message, whether the establishment wants to hear it or not, is crystal clear. Britain can recover. Britain can prosper. But only if we actually embrace the revolution we voted for. Only if we treat entrepreneurship as something to be celebrated rather than taxed into oblivion. Only if we accept that genuine change is incompatible with leaving the establishment in charge. Right now, we're trapped between two worlds, neither properly inside the EU nor genuinely independent. And if we don't break free from that limbo, Longworth warns, the consequences will be severe. This is what actually matters in British politics. Not the Westminster gossip, not the personality clashes between politicians, but the fundamental question of whether we're going to build something genuinely new or whether we're going to continue managing decline in increasingly elaborate ways. That's a conversation John Longworth is forcing us to have. And frankly, it's the only conversation that matters. If you found this analysis compelling, and if you actually believe Britain deserves better than managed decline, then please subscribe to UK Connors. Because we're covering the stories and the voices that Westminster desperately wants you to ignore. We'll be back with more soon. Don't miss it.